A few years back, Microsoft hired Jim Gray.
Been at Microsoft about 10 years. I'm in the research division. I'm an old guy. I've been doing stuff in computing for a long time. I love computers. And I came to Microsoft to make the biggest computer that you could possibly imagine by just using the stuff that you could buy at Radio Shack. I should probably talk about some of my lunatic fringe views.
You seem to pick the right problem.
Jim's got the ability to understand it all, to be good at everything. I think to pick good problems, I think that's perhaps the most important thing. Jim's got breadth and depth. That's a wonderful thing. And he's also a good human being.
So I typically work on problems that I think are solvable.
You were born in San Francisco in 1944, and what is kind of interesting is your first language was Italian, and you spent the first 3 years of your life in the American Embassy.
Fundamentally, I was interested in how we understand things, and for theoretical things, there are moments where you don't understand and then you understand. So you finally get the proof to go through, or you finally get the crisp statement of the problem. So there were some aha moments there. And when you write code, there are aha moments when you find the bug.
He has a great sense of humor, and he's a very engaging person. I think that's a big component of it. Jim's always able to explain those things in terms of the things that are really real in our lives.
One of the things that I stole from Jim is never let the best get in the way of the better.
So work-life balance, a question for you. You have a daughter, you have a grandchild at this point, you're married. What are your hobbies? What do you do when you're not coming up with an aha moment?
Well, I love the outdoors. I love to go hiking. I read a lot. I have friends. I spend time with my friends. People are most important. And, you know, when people ask, you know, what are you proudest of, you always say your family. When you think about your academic career or your professional career, it's your professional family. And and the way you weight that is, if it's your professional family, well, it's how well they've done professionally and how well they've done as people. So I very much, you know, I hope Mike is proud of me, and I'm very proud of some of the people that I've mentored.
Well, welcome everyone. All of you are here both physically, and I know quite a few people are here virtually as well. Today's really going to be a tribute to Jim, you know, his work, his achievements, you know, the impact that he's had on computing and sciences, on Microsoft, and really on a personal level on all of us. We're privileged to have Jim's wife Donna here with us as well today. As I'm sure you all recall, it was a year ago that Jim disappeared off the coast of San Francisco while on a sailing trip. His absence over the last year has weighed heavily on many of us. And even though we may never know what fate befell him, we thought it would be appropriate for us today to get together to talk about Jim and the things that he that he's done to voice our respect for his work and his accomplishments and our profound fondness for him as a human being and the way he's touched our lives. Over the next hour, we're going to hear from a number of people who've worked closely with Jim over the decades, and really they're going to give their own personal salute to Jim and his impact. We've asked several of our speakers to talk particularly about Jim's contributions and particular aspects of his work, but others will also share their opportunities that they had to work with him and what it meant to them on a very personal level. So I'm going to begin really by providing my own personal view and my own personal perspective. I honestly don't know how many speeches I gave over the years where I would say the line that, you know, Jim Gray is the kind of person you'd want your children to grow up to be like. You know, over the years, I've made that comment, and it really exemplified the way I thought about Jim. You know, you have hopes and dreams for your children. You want them to grow up to have an impact, to make a difference in the world. But at the same time, you want them to exemplify, you know, key human values. Humility, kindness, a willingness to help and support others. Jim was incredibly smart. He's incredibly accomplished. But at the same time, he was very unassuming in person, incredibly generous with himself and his time, and he was always thinking about others. I think it's indicative of who he was that almost every conversation I ever had with Jim was about someone else. It was about something someone else did. It was about their accomplishments, or it was about someone else's problem that he was working to help solve. It was Jim's willingness to give of himself, to educate, to mentor, and to support others, and to solve other people's hard problems that made him really one of the most beloved people in our field. It was really that love, I think, that was most evident in the extraordinary worldwide effort to find Jim when he went missing last year. So many people cared about him, and so many people tried so hard to find him. That search transcended anything that had come before it, using new tools, new technologies, in diverse communities of people, many of whom never met Jim, really only knew what other people had said about him. Boats, planes, submarines, satellites were all deployed in the search. Computers around the world were brought to bear, and armies of people looked over images. Ultimately, that search ended without discovery, and that's a pain that we all still feel. If you go online, you can learn a little bit about Jim's early life. Actually, that's how I learned about it. He grew up in a working-class neighborhood in South San Francisco. By all accounts I've read, he was very much, as a child growing up, the way he was as an adult. He was smart, compassionate, fiercely independent. I read a report from reporter Briar Dudley of the Seattle Times where he interviewed a friend of Jim's family that told stories about Jim as a child, going out by himself to find bears at Yosemite, or swimming out past the breakwater in Santa Cruz. His professional career is very well documented. He was the first computer science PhD student at University of California, Berkeley. From there, he did a short stint at Bell Labs and then went on to really start his career in earnest at IBM Research in San Jose. He became a pioneer in the field of databases and transactions to the point where many people would refer to him as the father of his field. Everywhere he went, he had an enormous impact, whether it was IBM, Tandem, Digital, or Microsoft. His impact is measured not just on the technical accomplishments he himself made, but also on the numbers of people around the world whose work he inspired. You know, I tried hard. I can't remember when I first met Jim. I'm sure it was at a conference. I certainly remember, I have images in my mind of him at conferences in the early days. But I know I got to really know Jim when he and I and David Gifford were teaching a course together, a systems course, summer course at Stanford. I was impressed at the time by his command of his subject, by the approach he took to teaching, but also by the empathy that he had for the students and the way he interacted with them. That experience really made me jump at the chance to hire Jim when he first let me know that he was available and potentially interested, even though it meant that we might have to start a new lab in San Francisco. I very fondly remember the day we spent together walking around Market Street, talking about the new lab, sitting outside, having lunch. I think at the time, neither one of us had even the remote idea of what we would accomplish together over the next 10 years. I also remember the conversation I had with Jim when he came to my office to talk about this idea of putting a large terabyte database on the internet. That led to the creation of the Terra server. And really, the subject of that conversation was, what would we put on in this database? And we hatched this idea of using satellite imagery, which turned out to work remarkably well. And then the Terra server became the largest online database of its era, and really the granddaddy of all the services today that do online satellite imagery. My last strong memory of Jim was at the 21st Century Computing Conference in 2006 with Harry and Han and all the guys in China. We lectured there together, but the enduring image I have is of Jim sticking his head through the Great Wall of China. There's a little window, and he had his head sticking through it. I remember him standing in front of a bell and ringing it 10 times for luck. And then I've got this image of Jim riding a toboggan down a mountain from a Buddhist temple. Those are great memories. In many of my speeches, I was fond of saying that the only reason we had a group in San Francisco was because of Jim. And I would say, if Jim wanted to live in Monaco, we'd have a research group in Monaco. Well, we would have. So now I'd like to invite Butler Lampson to come up. Butler's known Jim longer than most of us, and I'd like him to share his recollections.
There we go. I may have known Jim longer than anyone else who's here. I met Jim in 1967 when I was a newly minted assistant professor in the newly minted computer science department at Berkeley, and Jim was a graduate student. Jim apparently had been an undergraduate at Berkeley and overlapped with me when I was a graduate student there, but I never ran across him as an undergraduate. He wrote his PhD thesis about a topic in automata theory, which I guess was a natural outgrowth of his undergraduate major, which was in math and engineering. But Jim was a sensible guy, and he realized that systems are much more interesting than theory, especially in those days when theory was really quite boring compared to the way it is now. Do you remember what theory was like in the late 60s, Jennifer? It was pretty boring in the late 60s, I can tell you. I remember it well. So I think Jim, although Jim did write 5 papers jointly with Mike Harrison, I think he pretty much gave up theory for systems, which was a good thing for everyone. The only thing that I ever worked on professionally, collaborated intimately on professionally with Jim, was CalTSS, which was a time-sharing system that was built at the university in the late 60s. It ran on a mainframe of the time, the CDC 6400, which was the baby brother of the 6600, which was the supercomputer of the time. And it had a quarter of a megabyte of RAM, which was a fair amount for those days, and an unthinkably large 4 megabytes of so-called extended core store, which was a RAM disk with a transfer rate of 100 megabytes per second, which was just, you can't imagine what that was like in the late 60s. And Jim Gray and Howard Sturgis and I did most of the design of that system, along with some other people whose names you might recognize, such as Charles Simoni. The ideas of intentions list and write once shadow pages that were developed for that system by Howard were subsequently used in System R and some of them in many later systems. We both left Berkeley around 1971, and after that I never collaborated closely with Jim, but our careers were intertwined in various interesting ways. Jim worked on databases and fault tolerance for about 20 years, first at IBM and then at Tandem. And I was at Xerox and then later at DEC, working on quite a wide variety of things, but one of them was fault tolerance and transaction processing. And the place where our work coincided most closely was that we have both worked on the issue of how to do transaction processing in a distributed system. Howard Sturgis and I at Xerox and Jim and some of his colleagues at IBM independently worked out the schemes for two-phase commit that are now fairly widely used. Both of us tried to do correctness proofs for those schemes, but that was beyond the state of the art in the late 70s. I think we both bombed out on that at the time. It took about 10 years before we were able to figure out, thanks to the work of people like Leslie Lamport, how to actually do that. And it took even longer before we realized that the two-phase commit is actually just a special case of the so-called consensus problem, which is now, on which a large amount of work has been done. It's now much better understood than it was at the time. At that time, we were really groping in the dark. And I can remember consulting with all the experts on doing correctness proofs for parallel programs in the late 70s, and none of them could figure out how to attack this problem. I don't remember consulting with Leslie about this, actually. Maybe if I had, things would have evolved somewhat differently. The other place where we touched was closely related to this. Howard Sturgis and I worked out in a lot of detail schemes for doing reliable storage of data on unreliable storage media, so-called stable storage, what we called stable storage. And Jim picked up on that and propagandized in its favor quite a bit. Neither we nor Jim at the time, I think, really understood the power of redo logging. So the various schemes that we worked out look fairly crude by today's standards. And the whole thing was a little bit odd because at the time, Xerox and IBM were suing each other over xerography patents. And so it was a very standoff relationship. We weren't allowed to get together terribly much. Mostly we had to communicate via published material. There was one memorable occasion on which an internal Xerox memo was, by mistake, put in an envelope and sent off to, I think, to Jim, but certainly to someone at IBM Almaden. And this created a gigantic flap with teams of lawyers from both sides getting together to try to make sure that nothing terrible was going to happen as a result. During this time, Jim was mostly working on databases, and databases were fairly peripheral to my interests. Of course, Jim's work on System R demonstrated that relational databases were practical and thus gave rise, either directly or indirectly, to pretty much the whole of today's database industry. We did build a database system at Xerox PARC, but we never actually used it successfully. The application that we chose for it was, since we weren't into the kinds of business data processing that databases were mainly used for in those days, the application we chose was email, and we did build and deploy an email system based on our database. But what we learned from that was that in 1980 it was a really, really bad idea, because what you paid for the privilege of having the database system was much, much more than the benefit that the email system got for it. Today I think you'd make that trade-off differently. But in the late 80s, Jim wrote another very influential paper on why do computers stop, which has taught a great many people, including myself, most of what they know about the realities of fault-tolerant computing. So I learned a lot from that paper, and I learned even more from Jim's book with Andreas Reuter, Transaction Processing Concepts and Techniques, which I believe is still the Bible on the subject. If you haven't read that book, it's just an amazing book, and you definitely should look at it. Maybe not all 1,000 pages of it, but it's definitely worth perusing. But the most important thing I learned from Jim at that time was that the big success of parallel computing was in databases. And I think, to first approximation, that's still true. It's just beginning to shift. database people have been enormously successful in applying parallel computing in ways that ordinary mortals can actually take advantage of. And that's certainly continuing. During the 90s, the late 80s and the 90s, Jim's career and mine continued to be intertwined. I was working for digital research in Palo Alto. Jim joined DEC around 1990 and started a lab in San Francisco, and then we both moved to Microsoft about the same time. We both also did a lot of public service. We were both on the National Academy's Computer Science and Telecommunications Board, and we overlapped there for a while. That was a lot of fun to be in one of those meetings with Jim. Jim was much more diligent about these things than I was. So he served, for example, on the President's Information Technology Advisory Committee, and worked hard to try to get the government to do sensible things about computing. Jim won the Turing Award in 1998, and his Turing Award lecture and associated paper was published in a more or less final form in the 50th anniversary issue of the Journal of the ACM in 2003. I think is still very much worth reading as a catalog of why the people who say that computing is more or less finished and there's nothing interesting left to do are completely wrong. He has a wonderful list of a dozen things ranging from making a computer that can see as well as a person to making it possible to build a system that millions of people use that can be administered by one part-time person. And that paper completely trumped my contribution to that issue, which only had a couple of things in it. But one of those things has caught on now and has been rechristened by Ed Lazowska as reckless driving. The original name for it, label for it, was reduce highway traffic deaths to 0. But reckless driving is clearly so much better. We lived on opposite sides of the country since 1979, and as a result of that, I didn't have very many social interactions with Jim. But I do remember on one occasion being on his sailboat in San Francisco Bay with a small group of friends, which included Roger Needham. Roger himself was a pretty serious sailor and owned a 19th century wooden sailboat, which he sailed quite regularly. Jim was wearing his favorite costume for warm weather at the time, which was nothing. And Roger was wearing his trademark tweed jacket and red knit tie. So it's been very painful to lose both Roger and Jim. And I knew them both for a long time, and I certainly treasure Jim's memory. Thank you.
Thanks, Butler. Thank you, Butler. Next to talk about Jim's contribution to the field of computing, I'd like to invite Peter Spiro to come up.
Yeah, is the mic working? Okay. So for those of you who know me, sort of when they ask me to do something, I sometimes do the different thing. So they asked me to talk about Jim's contribution, and I'll touch on a little bit, but Butler did a pretty good job on this. And instead, I'll sort of talk about my career and how I saw Jim, and it does touch on, his inventions along the way. So as Butler said, Jim was at IBM in the 70s, built him System R. I was a grad student in the early 80s. Jim had come out, I think, in 1979 with the document Notes on Database Operating Systems. And, as a grad student in looking at database internals, this was just the Bible. This was the most wonderful document you could imagine. So right ahead logging, checkpoints, predicate locks. This was the real meaty stuff. And if you look at Jim's career and the stuff that he built, it was always relevant, always tied to real projects. And it was really the kind of stuff you could get your hand on, work out those lock modes, and it was just, wonderful to implementers. And this was a wonderful thing about what Jim did. All his work as implementers, we could look at this thing and say, man, this is just wonderful stuff, right, to dig into it. So, Gray made great contributions there. So, finally I got a job at DEC. I'm in the database internals group. Jim published his paper, I think in 1985, the debit credit benchmark, and there were like 50 other authors on this thing. I think it came out on April 1st, which Jim liked. That was he got a big laugh out of that. But, you know, so this had a tremendous impact on the industry. And then soon after that, Jim published a paper where Tandem had done 200 transactions a second. So at DEC, I'd run this debit credit benchmark, and we got 3 transactions a second. Okay? So first of all, we start out thinking this guy's a demigod. And then, you know, he comes out with 200 transactions a second, and we're at 3. It was just like, how are we going to compete with this guy? So I hadn't met Jim by that point, but I knew him from, you know, his papers, and it was just an unbelievable force. And, you know, how are we going to compete with this guy? And so then he published another paper, and I think he and maybe Dieter Garblich was on this paper, and they were talking about 1,000 transactions a second. And this was just phenomenal. This was insane. We couldn't even think about that, right? 200, we're getting our ass kicked, right, at 3 transactions a second. If we work really hard, we're going to get to 30 or 100. You know, 1,000 was just mind-blowing. I mean, it really was. An impact on the developers, just, you know, who is this guy? So for, you know, 10 years, I'm like, who the hell is this guy? He's my nemesis. You know, we're trying to have this career. You're trying to build databases. And he's just kicking your ass left and right. Seriously. So, you know, finally he ends up coming to DEC, and you get to meet him. And I think as most people have had the experience, you've, you know, put this guy on this huge pedestal. You finally meet him. He's the most down-to-earth guy that you've ever met. No ego, you know, super high IQ, seems so wise, so mature. You know, any argument you have, Jim's got this wonderful description of how it should go and things like this. And a lot of times during the DEC years, he was working on this book with Reuter. The kind of interesting story at DEC at this time, we were redoing the product because, you know, we're only 3 transactions a second. And so we formed design teams. You know, one guy would look at, 3 to 4 guys would look at the buffer pool, another team would look at the lock manager, stuff like this. So we invited Gray to participate in some of these design meetings. And the problem was, you know, Jim would come in and he would know all the answers. So we're a bunch of young guys, we're trying to learn, and Jim would say, you know, just do the buffer pool like this, you do the lock manager like this. So finally I had to kick him out of the meetings because we weren't really learning anything. Gray would come in, he'd give us the answer. And so we kind of shoot him off to the side. But, you know, the thing about Jim is he always had an impact on you, okay? And he was always forcing you to think differently. So then, you know, as I got to know him more and I started learning what was making him different. I was at the HPTS conference one year, High Performance Transaction Systems. This is a conference we have in California every other year. It mostly consists of Jim's friends, right? So the people that Jim worked with at IBM or Tandem or DEC or eventually Microsoft. And I think it was Vaskevitch was presenting about object-oriented systems. And the IBM guys were kind of listening to David and poo-pooing it. Like, you know, our mainframe customers don't need this. And Gray was really listening and really trying to learn. And it struck me at that moment. Now, this is how Gray has been so good and continues to be good and will be good because he was always learning, right? He was willing to talk to anyone and everyone and see what he could pull out, see what he was going to learn from someone. So he didn't have the big ego. He would go in, say, how can I help? Tell me what your problems are, stuff like that. But it really struck me at that moment, at that conference, is Gray, now this is a dynamic industry we live in. You have to change. You have to evolve. And Gray was the master at this. He would look at problems. He would continue to evolve. And you saw that evolution, right, looking at new problems. And I think that's what made him so special and not locked into any time period, right? It would have been real easy for him to just lock into the late 70s and stick there, but that's not what he did. He continued to evolve. You know, Gray pretty much staffed a lot of the enterprise groups here at Microsoft. After DEC, he was talking to Vaskevitch. He said, well, I think you want to maybe hire Spiro or Berenson or Lomet. And he pointed out to David all the people in the industry. And he had done that because he was such a wonderful collaborator, right? Friends with everyone, knew everyone. He's probably the most connected guy in our industry. And so, huge impact. You know, the debit credit thing that he worked on, that has driven changes for us for the past 20 years. You know, from mid-'80s through about year 2000, we just kept making these systems better because of the framework and the foundation that Jim had put in place there. And that's just been an unbelievable impact. You know, when I got to Microsoft, we had to redo the database product again. and it's kind of a funny thing, at DEC, so we eventually started making progress. Jim would call us from San Francisco, because Jim always liked to play with the products, right? So Jim wasn't just researching and thinking about stuff. He'd take the product and he'd play with it. Then he'd call you on the phone and say, I don't understand how this works. So he'd be running the debit credit benchmark. He'd get like 50 transactions a second. We had maybe published 100 or 200. And he's like, how are you getting this to work? And my numbers are only like 50. And so we'd tell him, well, you got to change the buffer pool size, change the lock hierarchy, the page locking, you're doing it the wrong way. Commit sequence has to be, increased to 10 to 20 milliseconds. So this drove him crazy because, it's only the experts that could get the performance out of the product. And so he started, railing on me around no knobs and make the system simpler and stuff like that. So I think if you look at the evolution of the current SQL Server product, where we really came here and said we have to make this product simpler, a lot of that comes from Jim Gray not knowing how to use the product at DEC. And, it was a big impact on us. All right. So lessons learned from Jim, right? Jim has had an unbelievable impact, and for the most part, it's not necessarily been about technology. And in my mind, one of the most important things about Jim was that he always kept learning. Okay, that is the key. Our industry changes too much. You have to keep learning. So if you get locked into anything, you're not going to make the progress. Jim is always willing to look at new things and continue to evolve. And for me, that's something I think about, and I preach this to my people, and that's, I think, a way to be living as an engineer. Collaboration, relationships, unbelievably important. Okay? Jim, I was talking to Jose, everyone has a Jim story. You're in the hallway, you talk to these guys, and Jose was telling me, Jim comes up and says to him the first time, how can I help? And that's just a classic thing. You'd be in your office, Jim walks in, how can I help? And, he was just willing to do whatever you needed him to do. So many times I'd call him and, hey, Jim, can you call this student? He's thinking of between us and IBM. And Jim would call him, and Jim put special value on people and relationships. He developed what I call this virtuous cycle. There's some researchers or engineers, you have this new invention, you hide it. Jim was always open with stuff, and he always collaborated with people. And the less you're possessive of your ideas, the more people want to interact with you. So it forms this virtuous cycle, right? So more people want to interact with you, and the more you learn. And that's, something that Jim had taught me, and I think he did it better than anyone in the industry. Finally, Jim's work was always pragmatic, right? You go look at his research papers. They're always interesting papers to read, and it's based on problems that we really have to solve. Now, another interesting thing is you go look at the collaborators. A huge range of people, right, from earth sciences to, why disks are failing, scale-out systems. So Jim was very pragmatic in the research he did. I think that's what made it so valuable to me as an implementer and all the people in the product side of the house. And, just a wonderful combination. He was always learning, he was always collaborating, and he had great taste in, picking the right kinds of projects to work on. So for me, that's Jim's biggest impact, right? He taught me how to be an engineer. It's not about locked, systems. It's how you have to act, and I think that's the big impact, and that's the thing we need to look at and carry forward. Thank you.
Thanks, Peter. So David Lomet probably has had the opportunity to work with Jim in 3 different companies for more than 30 years. And David's now going to come up and share some of his thoughts about Jim. David?
It's a big step approach. Yeah. Can you hear me? I knew it was going to be difficult following Peter. Most database researchers regard Jim as this legendary figure who won the Turing Award for his database and transaction processing work. And his early and continuing technical contributions guaranteed that. But I actually knew Jim before that legend. As Rick indicated, my connection with Jim goes back almost 35 years to when we were both at IBM. I can remember when Jim was not a technical leader in the database field. This was before relational databases, before System R. It's really hard it's impossible to overstate how important System R was. It was the genesis of relational database systems, and what it did was it proved that they were real. And Jim was a technical leader in that effort. and in particular in the area of transaction processing. A few years ago, I had a chance to write a paper, to contribute something on what was the most influential paper in my career. And Peter has already mentioned it. It's the Jim's notes on database operating systems, which grew directly out of his System R experience. And in fact, suggested ways of doing things which were not in System R. And that was, as Peter indicated, a Bible for many of us for many years on how to do these kinds of systems. What's interesting is that Jim's connection to System R almost didn't happen. Jim, as has been pointed out before, grew up in California, and he wanted to live there. But IBM would not authorize a move from Yorktown, which is where Jim was first hired. So Jim quit and moved to California. Only then did IBM rehire him, which has to be one of the smartest moves that IBM has made, perhaps the last one. But they couldn't keep him. And Jim later left for Tandem, where he played a major role in the nonstop SQL operating database system. And while at Tandem, as has been pointed out, Jim produced some really eye-opening reports on why systems fail. He also defined what became the TPC debit-credit benchmark in a Datamation article. Interestingly, the authors were listed as Anand et al. Jim was clearly Anand, since he was the first author. I don't know, does anybody remember Datamation? It was for, yeah, some of you. You can tell your ages. It was, for 25 years, it was the leading popular computer industry publication. And to influence the industry, not just the researchers, it was really the place to publish. And Jim was, in fact, out to change the industry, so that's why the paper was published there. Later, I actually played an enthusiastic, if minor role in recruiting Jim to DEC. First, we had to convince Jim that DEC was really serious about databases. And then we had to convince DEC that Jim should have a lab in San Francisco. This worked, and Jim made an enormous contribution to DEC, the most public part of which was the alpha sort, which demonstrated that alpha's blazing speed could be translated into blazing transaction processing performance. I actually worked with Jim on alpha sort, and I sort of shared the glory when that paper was given the Sigmod Best Paper Award. The paper really showcased Jim's unique writing style. The result was that what he did was he compared the ratios of storage access times to everyday times. So the result of this was that he equated a processor cache access time to the time you spend searching for something on your desktop. Using that same scale, he went on to show that reading the disk was equivalent to traveling to Pluto. And going to tape archive was equivalent to going to the Andromeda galaxy. After DEC exited the database business, fate led me to Microsoft. Well, actually, Jim had a lot to do with that as well, and it was partly as a result of a very strong reference letter that he wrote for me. This was the second time he had done that, so I really have a real debt to Jim on that. So let me now replay the previous story. I played an enthusiastic, if minor, role in recruiting Jim to Microsoft. First, we convinced Jim that Microsoft was serious about databases. Then we convinced Rick that Jim should have a lab in San Francisco. And this worked again. And once again, Jim made an enormous contribution, this time to Microsoft. In 1998, I met with Bill Gates to help prepare for Bill's Sigmod keynote speech. And I remember at that time, Bill saying, when asked about some database technology, that Jim had told him about it. And Bill had great confidence that Jim was not just technically correct about the subject, but also had judged it correctly. It's difficult, as you all know, to impress Bill Gates, but Jim surely had. I want to touch on another thing which Jim is known for. He's known for acknowledging technical contributions of others. Many workers in the database field would be unknown
except for Jim's scrupulous citation of their work. So when it came time to write his book, he felt it was essential to credit the contributions made by IBM's Mohan. Mohan was, however, a bit of a rival. Nonetheless, Jim didn't hesitate to credit him. Later, however, he did jokingly refer to his book as Encyclopedia Mohanicus. More commonly, he was enthusiastic about other people's work, and he was, in fact, a strong advocate for my own work on key range locking during the Sphinx time frame. And that worked out particularly well since, through the efforts of Dave Campbell, that became part of the Sphinx release. I want to end by saying something about Jim's research. Because for researchers, we're always looking for what the magic was as to why someone stands out in such a wonderful way. And I think that this is the case, that what his research was not only about clever algorithms and hard problems. What distinguishes the work was the number of times in which he defined what the problems were. Things like recovery, transaction commit, concurrency control, why systems fail, sorting, and more. He always seemed to be working in the future. I remember him defining petabytes for me when I was still trying to remember what terabytes were. So my memories of Jim remain fresh. He made a great and lasting impression on me, and I'm really grateful for the opportunity to talk about it.
Thanks, sir. Thank you, David. About 10 years ago, Jim began acting as the leading light in the sort of revolutionizing process, changing the way science is done, very broadly by bringing advanced computing into science. So I'd like to ask Tony Hay to come up and share with us his thoughts about what Jim accomplished in advancing the sciences and how he went about doing it. Tony?
So in this talk, I'll try and do justice to Jim's remarkable achievements in working with the science community over the last 10 years or so, and I'll include a few personal anecdotes about some of my own interactions with Jim. One of the comparisons I want to make goes back over 30 years when I arrived fresh from Oxford with a PhD label around my neck and wearing a suit and a tie. I arrived at Caltech to be greeted by Nobel Prize winner Richard Feynman wearing a, open neck shirt and jeans. I never wore a tie again for the next 2 years. It's surprising, perhaps, that I think there are some striking similarities between Nobel Prize winner Richard Feynman and Turing Award winner Jim Gray. It's the way they attack problems. Feynman was a great physicist because he was never content to take anybody's word. He always wanted to work things out for himself and to do the physics calculations his way. Feynman's great achievement in physics was democratizing relativistic quantum field theory, making possible for ordinary mortals to do very complex calculations using his simple set of tools called Feynman diagrams. And like Feynman, Jim was never content to take anyone else's word about a problem, but always insisted on understanding things his way. And in a very real sense, I think Jim's achievement in science was in a similar democratization of entire research communities by introducing them to something better than flat files and the power of databases as a way to interrogate and manage huge quantities of scientific data. I think Jim first started looking at scientific data in the late 1990s with Tom Barclay. One of the stories I like from Tom is that Tom was at DEC and was Jim's manager. And when he came to Microsoft, Jim was Tom's manager. So I thought that was a nice symmetry. In 1998, they built the Terra server, which Rick talked about, which was the first site on the web to display geographical images. And typical of Jim, it was also one of the first applications of SOAP and XML web services. And it was built, yes, using one of our betas, a .NET Beta 2, to realize this vision of a terra server. And it is, if you like, the great granddaddy of the sort of services for science, services in the cloud, if you like, that we're beginning to see today. The site won an award for the best of the web, 1998, from Popular Mechanics magazine. And it also won from the US Geological Survey the John Wesley Powell Award. Now, as many of you will know, but I suspect not everybody, John Wesley Powell was a very special American. He was the first person to go down the Grand Canyon and was a very intrepid explorer. So it seems a pretty appropriate tribute to Jim as a pioneer. He had only one arm. They went down in wooden boats down the Grand Canyon, and they had no idea whether when next bend there would be a 100-foot drop or whether they'd be able to get down, and he was really a remarkable man. And I think it's a pretty appropriate tribute to Jim, likening him to Wesley Powell. So I checked with Tom Barclay before writing about Terra Server, and Jim's opinion is rather similar to the story I've told. He thought Jim's great two strengths were the ability to dissect a large or complicated problem or solution into simple natural model that could be explained not only to his intellectual peers and technically talented people, but also to mere mortals. And secondly, his willingness to charge headfirst into areas and domains that he was not an expert in. In this sense, he was very similar to John Wesley Powell, who first navigated the Colorado River through the Grand Canyon with only one arm and strapped to a wooden boat. And Tom goes on to say that he, like me, doesn't know too many highly regarded and successful academics and researchers who are willing to go and risk their reputation by diving into areas they don't know anything about. Feynman did that too. Feynman spent several years working on biology, working on solid-state physics, besides the particle physics. And it is a thing I think great engineers and scientists can do. Terra Server. Well, the usage statistics for Terra Server are still pretty impressive, an average of 60,000 unique visitors a day and around 2 million daily page views. It was the predecessor to things like Virtual Earth and also became the foundation for his work with the astronomy community, which I'm just about to say. Jim's prescription for I should have said that the Terra Server still lives on. We've just moved it to our Vexel subsidiary in Colorado, and it's still serving useful purpose to this day, nearly 10 years on. Jim used to have a prescription for finding people to work with in the sciences. It was very simple. What he looked for people, he looked for scientists who were desperate. If they were drowning in data, he felt that they would be prepared to talk to him. He also particularly liked the astronomy community because he said it was great, the astronomy community, because absolutely true that their data had absolutely no commercial value, and you could do lots of things with it. So observational astronomy is actually in the midst of a revolution, and one of the things generating the revolution was the Sloan Digital Sky Survey, which looked at a quarter of the whole sky in very high resolution, generating terabytes of data. And there are going to be many more surveys generating terabytes and petabytes of data in the future. So the Sloan Digital Sky Survey was, like, if you like, a cosmic genome project. It had pictures of about 300 million celestial objects, and Jim was trying to convert the astronomers from files to at least think about databases. So he worked with his friend and collaborator, Alex Saleh, the astronomer at Johns Hopkins. And with Alex, he worked with the astronomers to cast what they wanted to know to extract from the data in terms of what he called 20 queries. And you can see exactly why he wanted to do that, because once he got the queries that they wanted the data, he could cast these as relational database queries. So Sky Server was built on top of SQL Server and .NET and has about 3 terabytes of Sloan data. It's now had nearly 400 million web hits in 6 years, and it's also had about 1 million distinct visitors. Now that's interesting because there certainly aren't 1 million astronomers in the world. There are probably around about 10,000. And this means that there's really huge impact on the public. And even now you can actually find, built on top of Sky Server, you can find a mashup called Galaxy Zoo, which invites the public, you, for example, to help them classify these 300 million objects in the database. So they have a target of around 1 million galaxy classifications by the public, and so far they have over 100,000 participants. I did find it amusing. I was a reviewer for the NSF for their National Virtual Observatory project. So we were doing a formal review, and it was so we eventually summoned in the PIs, and in walks the astronomers and Jim. So Jim was on the other side of the panel, and we were interrogating Jim. I found that amusing. So with Catherine Van Ingen in the San Francisco Center, we're now working to try and adopt Jim's techniques with different communities. So Catherine is working with the Berkeley Water Center using a similar philosophy that Jim used with the astronomers. Instead of 20 queries, Catherine's trying to get the environmental scientists to talk about 20 graphs that they want to get from their data. And so with Deb Agarwal from Lawrence Berkeley Lab, they built an environmental data server, rather similar to Sky Server. It's also based on SQL Server, and it now serves over 900 site years of carbon climate field data from 160 field teams now around the globe. And so we hope that will have a similar effect on part of the environmental science community as Jim's Sky Server has had on the astronomers. As we've heard, it's not possible to mention all of Jim's science projects because he had so many and he touched so many people. But I would like to highlight one that he felt passionately about, was his work with Jean Pauli and the NIH National Library of Medicine. Working with the National Library of Medicine team, Jim and Jan developed a portable version of the National Library's repository called PubMed Central. And the idea was that researchers who got a grant from NIH to do research, they were encouraged, I think the word was encouraged, to deposit the full text of the paper that they'd written up on their research 12 months after publication in Science or Nature. So it went to Science or Nature, but after 12 months, it went in this database that anybody could see, you and I could see it, because after all, our taxes have funded NIH, our taxes have paid for this form of open access that Jim felt very passionately about. Unfortunately, after several years of trying this encouragement, only less than 10% of the researchers actually deposited their papers in the repository. And Jim really liked doing things. He didn't like politics very much, but he felt sufficiently strongly about this to go and lobby in Washington, D.C. for legislation to make deposit of publications in the repository, PubMed Central, a mandatory condition of a grant. So it's been a very long road, but Jim would have been very delighted to know that President Bush signed the NIH mandate that requires researchers to deposit their papers into law in December of last year. Moreover, in the UK, the Wellcome Trust, who fund a lot of medical research in the UK, have just put up their version of PubMed Central International. This was the portable version that Jim and Jan worked on, and they're now making it a condition of their grants that full-text versions of research papers are deposited in their version of PubMed Central. And I'll actually be going to the formal opening of that next Monday. I do actually remember the first time I met Jim. It was at CERN in Geneva, and David Williams and I went out for dinner with Jim, and we had a great time. We had a lively debate, and we came back really inspired. And we dropped Jim off at his hotel, and I was staying with David. We went in, and we were still talking and fizzing. And I remember waking up in the middle of the night hearing a thunderstorm. So when I got out in the morning to go to CERN with David, he was very shamefaced, because in our excitement the night before, we'd left the car roof open, so we drove all the way to CERN sitting on plastic bags on our seats. So I do remember that. So Jim and I had some great debates and arguments about e-science and grids and so on for nearly 5 years. And I initially favored the sort of grid middleware complexity thing, but actually over the years it became quite clear that Jim's, simple is difficult enough. If you can't, doing it simply is difficult enough. Trying to do it with all this complexity is really making life impossible. So I became convinced of that, and I was running the UK e-science program at the time. And after 5 years of debates with Jim, it was just easier to join Microsoft, right? And I remember my interview loop. You have an interview loop of, Craig Monday, all these people. And at the end of the day, my interview was Jim. So I call up Jim in San Francisco because he didn't come up for the interview loop. And we just had a nice chat. I do remember that. And he was a great friend and supporter of our mission of bringing computing technologies to help scientists to do, increasingly looking for smaller and subtle signals, smaller needles in ever larger haystacks or volumes of data. All right. And I remember my first presentation to the research area managers in Microsoft Research. Jim flew up specially from San Francisco to Redmond, specifically to come to my defense, if needed, from these ferocious research area managers. And it certainly was reassuring having Jim in the audience. So in the debates I had throughout the years, it always seemed to me that I never made much headway against Jim's powerful arguments, as we've heard today. Jim really had thought things out deeply. So it was with great surprise and really a feeling of honor that I learnt that Jim had actually called his research group the eScience Research Group. Now, thank you very much.
Thanks, Tony. One of the most amazing things about Jim is that in the midst of revolutionizing multiple fields, he could always find time to be a friend, a supporter, a mentor to those people around him. I'd like to ask James Hamilton to come up now and share his thoughts on what it was like to have Jim as a mentor.
You can't work in software and not know Jim Gray and have not have read of Jim Gray. It's just not possible. His contributions, technically, are legendary. But what I think is even more impressive about Jim's contributions are those contributions as a mentor, those contributions as a connector of people, and those contributions as a bridger of fields. These are the things that, for me, are most notable because these are the things that are leveraged. They help other people achieve more. And for me, they're even more important. I first met Jim back in '94. Pat Selinger, who was my mentor at the time, drove up to introduce me to Jim up at his home in San Francisco. I met him again. Bruce Lindsay and I went up to Berkeley and had a great evening wrestling around Berkeley campus. That afternoon, I drove back into San Francisco with Jim for dinner. I slouched down in the passenger seat. When we drove slowly towards the Bay Bridge in heavy traffic. And I remember this really distinctly. He was reflecting on his experience at Digital and talking about how frustrating it was that Digital insisted on failing in hardware when they could be wildly successful at software. The Bay Bridge, the city, and the sunset beyond still sticks in my mind. As I'm sitting there, I should be making conversation with Jim, but I'm mostly just listening and contemplating and reflecting. Jim's talking about his time at Digital, and it's eerily familiar. It's almost as though Jim's describing my experience at IBM rather than his at DEC. Started to become clear to me at the time it was time to consider working for a software company. I saw Jim again months later at HPTS. Sometime during the conference, Jim came over, sat down beside me and said, "How are you, James Hamilton?" This is classic Jim, signature Jim. You'll see him making the rounds at every conference. Almost everyone in this room has had one of these visits. He drops down, matches eyes, and for the next 15 or 20 minutes, you've got 110% of Jim's focus. It's not his style to redirect or to correct. But yet, every one of these conversations, when I'm done, I find I'm doing something differently, or I've changed focus slightly, or I'm doing something a little bit differently. In 2006, I got a note from Jim with a subject line, mentor. They said I had to help someone, so it may as well be you. This is Jim. I figured, yeah, this is great. It's kind of cute. It won't change anything. We talk several times a week. It won't make any difference at all. And, of course, I'm completely wrong. Jim actually takes this responsibility with the same kind of commitment and vigor and follow through that he takes on everything in his life. He thinks what mentor means is that he has to help you with absolutely everything you do, every problem you work on, every challenge you face in life, even if it's not work related. Doesn't matter. Everything. We start to talk daily. I wrote 2 articles last year for major boating magazines. Jim insisted he had to review them. I have pages and pages of notes from Jim explaining the finer nuances of marine power generation and battery technology. The papers are better for it. I have no idea how Jim finds time. For years, I've read every paper Jim sent my way. He's become my quality filter for papers. As much as I try, I can never cast my net as wide as Jim. I can never possibly read as much as Jim. Like him, I'm interested in all aspects of technology, everything. But unlike him, I actually need to sleep once in a while. So he becomes my best of source. He sends me things, I read them all. Many people across our industry, I'm certain many people in the room, get exactly the same service from Jim. As a consequence of that, good results travel faster and travel further. Jim's magic as a mentor, a connector, and a bridger is the scaling. The personal stories I've described up to now can be matched by hundreds of people. Hundreds of people have exactly the same experience. We all think we had Jim's complete and undivided attention. Every one of us think that. To contribute this deeply is amazingly time-consuming. To contribute this deeply while having personal technical achievements at the same time is nearly impossible. To do it for all callers is simply unexplainable. But anyone can talk to Jim, and everyone does. He receives early papers, important new results. Interesting work is always arriving at Jim, and he forwards it broadly. He knows no bounds. He ignores company bounds, international bounds, bounds of seniority, bounds of position, and simply routes people and useful data together. Jim effectively is a routing nexus where people, new ideas, and really interesting results come together and get distributed more broadly. Over the past year, I've received no papers from Jim. There's been no advice. He's reviewed nothing of mine over the past year. When I attend conferences, there have been no visits. Instead, I've been operating on, what would Jim do? That's what's been driving my thinking for the last year. Each of us in this room, each of us everywhere, has opportunities to be mentors and connectors and bridgers. These are our chances to help Jim scale even further. Each of these opportunities is a chance to pass on the gift that Jim has given to us over the years. When you're asked for a review, or when you're asked for help with a project, just answer "great" with an exclamation mark or two, as he's done so many times in so many notes that we've all received over the years. And keep the good news spreading. Keep the magic spreading. This year, when I face tough questions, interesting issues, or great opportunities, I just ask myself, what would Jim do? And then I dive in with gusto.
Thank you, James. Jim's never been content to just deal with creating research prototypes or publishing papers. He always wanted to build real things and influence real products that end up in customers' hands. I'd like to ask David Vaskevitch now to come up and talk about the way Jim helped to make that happen here at Microsoft.
So the mic's live, good. 25 years ago, Bob Metcalf explained to me that in a room, any room, there are all the people who don't quite know what to do, and then there's the one person And then, because of them, without them necessarily even saying anything, everybody else just knows what to do. And it's about people. It's not about intelligence. I'm going to talk about some of that. But Microsoft has more smart people, I think, than any other company in the world. Probably there are people at Microsoft smarter than Jim who have written better papers. And Jim has done amazing work, but I'm going to keep coming back to the theme that Jim's real contribution to Microsoft, the reason that large parts of Microsoft are the way they are, have a lot to do with Jim. Jim as a person and the way Jim interacted with other persons. So around 1992, I had the idea that Microsoft should be in the enterprise. On the executive team of the company, the percent of people willing to support that idea was 0. There was no culture, no people who understood how to do that. And somewhere in that process, I came in contact with Jim. I left the meeting a changed person, and it was the beginning of my understanding of the power of his personality. So, you know, Jim had many great ideas. I want to start from the ideas and work forward to the people, and I want to try to talk about some of the ideas that haven't been talked about. When we were trying to do many of the things that we set out to do, the things that all the executives thought were impossible, you know, we're going to build a database, we're going to build a TP monitor, we're going to build a repository. Jim was always there to help us figure out how to do it, and more importantly, to push us to reach farther. Don't just build a database that runs itself. Don't just build a transaction system, build a cluster that can do 1 billion transactions per day. And we did many of those things, and it was because Jim thought of the ideas in the first place. We could never have done them without the people. When I think about the people in this room, the people who have spoken, spending almost a year hiring Peter, almost a year hiring James, you know, I could go on, and I can't think of how many times I would call somebody up, and before I could even suggest that, why don't you talk to Jim Gray, I would find out that sometimes they were already planning to do that. More often than not, they had been talking to Jim before they even agreed to talk to me in the first place. It was just like that. So I could go on about the technical ideas. There were so many of them. But the really interesting question is, what did those people talk to Jim about? They weren't talking to him about technical ideas. To some extent, they were talking to him about, was it even possible to imagine Microsoft being a serious player in the enterprise? And yes, that was a technical conversation. But Jim was connecting to them at some deep personal level. That's the thing that made Jim one of the people that when he was in the room, suddenly everybody knew where to go. And it's about the personal connection. So for me, when I think about the challenges we went through, we were building SQL Server, we wanted to put record locking into Sybase's code base, and we managed to do it before Sybase did it. Pretty amazing when you think about it. We had a disk format change, and we had to think through how do we get the customers to go through the transition without everything breaking, and what about if it failed? And yes, Jim was there in the middle of all those conversations and arguments. But then I think about, for example, you know, all the difficult people. For example, Adam Bosworth. How many of you here knew him? I'm sure a lot. When Adam was his most unhappy, Jim and I talking about it, and then Jim went sailing for a weekend with Adam. Both Jim and Adam told me how it was a great weekend and a terrible weekend. Both of them were committed to never doing it again. But as a result of that, Adam came back and did some of the greatest work that he had ever done at Microsoft. You know, when I think about the difficult times we all went through, you know, when I look at Pat over there and I know his connection with Jim, and I think about our idea that we were going to get into transactions, and Pat knew all about transactions, but one of the things that made Jim real is that when Pat was going through the process of his wife dying and all the rest of it, and trying to figure out how to find a new role at Microsoft, Jim was always there. So for me, one of the most difficult things was, how do you have the force of personality to create something like an enterprise group? And for me, it was Jim was there with the ideas. Jim was there to help me hire the people. If we hadn't hired those people, without a doubt, none of the products, none of the strategies, none of the business would exist. You know, it's billions of dollars, over $10 billion of business. But more important, Jim was really there for each one of us when we needed him. That was his biggest contribution to the company. The thing that sets Jim apart from all the other smart people, I mean, when I think about the fact that every one of my kids knew Jim, whenever things were the toughest, the saddest, the most difficult, somehow Jim would just be there. We would talk. Sometimes we'd go for a walk. We talked about technical problems. We talked about people. We talked about marriage. We talked about kids. The fact that Jim was there as a complete person, the fact that Jim was somehow able to be authentic, the fact that Jim lived life to the fullest, that was Jim's real contribution to the company. Yes, the technical stuff's all there, it's all important, but the thing that set Jim apart, that made him so different, was the completeness of Jim as a person. And so for me, I always think about that. It reminds me how important it is to keep focusing on the people, because that's what we're about. And for me, that's the whole. There's no way to fill it. I don't really know where Jim is, but mostly I know there's just a hole there. There's some complete person who isn't there anymore to help us be more complete people ourselves. And that's what I really value Jim for, and that was his contribution to the company. Thank you.
Thank you, David. There are two people who couldn't be here for today's event, but without whose voices we really couldn't have a complete tribute. Fortunately, they both recorded their thoughts on video, and so we can share their thoughts with you today. The first of these two is Bill Gates, and let's watch that video now.
I'm sorry I can't be there in person for the tribute to Jim Gray. I'm sure I speak for everyone when I say I felt privileged to know Jim. I remember Rick's enthusiasm when there was a chance to hire Jim, including putting a lab wherever Jim wanted to be based. As I was learning more about databases, people would say, oh, you should go talk to Jim. You know, I wanted to learn about transactions. They said, Jim knows about that. He basically invented the concept. Later, when distributed computing was changing the rules, Jim wrote really the key paper that explained how computation should be moved around. And I was willing to sit and make sure that I understood what that meant for Microsoft. And so again and again, whether it was data cubes or reliability, Jim, in his unassuming way, had advanced the state of the art and made sure that everyone understood what they needed to know. Jim was very ambitious in his thinking. The idea of taking the entire world and putting the images into the TerraServer database, that was a groundbreaking thing, and it forced us to think about capacity and new techniques. And then later, Jim turned to the sky itself, to astronomy, and had a concept of how the whole science of being able to take all the information from any of the different telescopes or data acquisition devices and make those available to turn that science into something where the tools of software would let people explore their new ideas. And the impact of his thinking there really is continuing to get people to think in a new way about how data and software are redefining what it means to do science. Jim's work was so phenomenal that despite his humble approach, people appreciated what an incredible genius he is. And I think his legacy, even beyond his work, is that the way he reached out to colleagues, the way he got people working together, the way he showed no ego in terms of just wanting things to advance and the great curiosity that he had that always pushed him out to the frontier, even after decades of breakthrough work. And so I know I'll miss Jim just like we all will. He was a unique person.
Gordon wasn't able to be here today either, but he's edited together and narrated his own video about Jim and sent it along from Australia. So let's watch that video now.
We are honored to know you, James Nicholas Gray. I'll introduce a few bits to bring you closer to us. To me, you were a high-tech legend, renowned database and transaction processing pioneer, a scientist, and much more. I was declared a crusty hardware guy. I don't remember exactly how or why we decided to meet at my house in '94. Now I never delete anything. We spent several hours just chatting about our beliefs, a sort of melding of minds, and perhaps that is when we began a heartfelt friendship. What struck me most was your thirst for and dynamic knowledge range. Whatever topic, I was impressed that you always added something new, something no one had thought of, something that extended the view. We agreed on the importance of university research, the need for experimental systems to advance computing, and a prejudice for small teams. Most important of all, we discovered we had the same system religion about computing and where it was going. Scalability using commodity clusters, scale out versus scale up. The scalability talks and laws governing computing in the spring of '95 have been dead on. You do find it in the 3 Berkeley lectures on SNAP. We agreed to spell scalability both with and without an E. I believe I won, though. Less is more. In January of '95, I started emailing Rick and Nathan to start work on scalability, hire you, and set up a San Francisco lab for you. You had been talking to them for a year. I do have your email rightfully claiming that you hadn't put me up to this. In August, you and Tom Barkley opened BARC, and I was delighted and honored to join. The first proof of scalability was Terra Server, followed by the Terra Service that proved the efficacy of .NET. Another proof came on Scalability Day in May 1997, when a large room of 100-plus servers achieved 1 billion transactions per day with your on-stage demo with Bill in New York City. Jim, you are uniquely courageous. Having conquered or encoded LAN, the collaboration with Alex Saleh went heavily, yielding the Sky Server and the .NET Sky Service. These are archetypes for science. At the same time, you were supporting external research in oceanography as well as other fields and incubating e-science. Your brief look into bioinformatics and contributions to that community amazed me. Your homepage shows your incredible intellectual and institutional diversity and collaborative spirit. During your usual 7 a.m. to 7 p.m. day, we marvel at your fearlessness and stamina to tackle any problem. In Stokes' book, Pasteur's Quadrant, you are up and to the right, where research is inspired by both fundamental understanding and utility. The Turing Award recognized science. Your Turing Award lecture posited a compelling research agenda, including a personal mimics to record everything a person sees and hears. With your support and encouragement, Jim Gemmel and I embarked upon that quest. Since 1994, there is only one place where we disagree. I'm sorry, but I think I'm right on this. You're just plain wrong. That said, your favorite restaurant, or at least one of them, Swan's Oyster Depot, is not a 3-star Michelin restaurant. Nathan Myhrvold would undoubtedly agree. But I do agree with your classic comment after one Thanksgiving lunch that it doesn't get much better than this. So, Jim, we won't forget. You've been an integral part of my life for the last 13 years. You are a mentor, high-tech brother, and a dearest and closest friends. thank you for helping turn life into an adventure. Just as I promised when you hired me, I am here telepresently and toast you from the land of Oz. So here's to you, mate. We wish you were here.
How I wish you were here. We're just two lost souls swimming in a fishbowl, year after year, running over the same old ground. What have we found? Same old fears. Wish you were here.
Well, we've heard from 9 different people today, and I think it's remarkable how consistent a view everyone has given of Jim. Brilliant, pioneering, a mentor, friend, intellectually demanding, and incredibly generous. I think it's fair to say we're all going to miss him terribly. And as Gordon said, we're not going to forget him. There were many more people who wanted to share their thoughts on Jim than we could really squeeze into an hour event like this. But we wanted to make sure that we captured some of those thoughts and were able to share them. In fact, I'd like to invite Jim's wife, Donna, up here to the stage now and give her a remembrance of this tribute today. This is a book that's been put together. It's a very beautiful book that shares the remembrances that people have of Jim and the comments people had from today. And so I wanted to give that to you as a remembrance of the event today and also to convey how much Jim meant to all of us.
You're his psychological family. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. So I'd like to thank everybody who's contributed to the event today. So many of you helped to put this together. I want to thank you for being here. This has really been an event to celebrate Jim and celebrate his contributions and the things he's done for us. Now, for those of you who are here in person, unfortunately not for those that are here virtually, I'd like to invite you to share some more time with us in an informal reception here in the atrium. Thank you.